A 17-year-old kid is floating on a homemade raft in the middle of Lake Michigan, laughing with his friends, having the best day of his summer. 96 degrees out, the whole city's at the water, and this kid, his name's Eugene Williams, has no idea that in the next few minutes, a rock is about to hit him in the forehead, he's going to sink under that water and never come back up, and his death is going to set off 8 days of hell that leaves 38 people dead, over 500 injured, and an entire section of a major American city burned to the ground. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. The guy who threw that rock never spent a single night in jail for it, not one. In fact, the cop standing right there on the beach who watched the whole thing happen ended up arresting one of the black witnesses instead. That's where we're starting today. Stick around, because by the end of this, there's a name that's going to come up, a name you 100% know, a name tied to Chicago politics for the next 50 years, and I promise you, you did not learn this part in school. All right, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is all about the pieces of American history that get quietly left out of the textbooks, not because they're boring, trust me, they're the opposite of boring, but because they're uncomfortable. I dig through the coroner's reports, the court records, the old newspaper archives, so you don't have to. Two things before we get into it. First, stick around to the end, because I promise there is a twist in this story that connects directly to something you've probably heard of and had no idea was linked. Second, hit subscribe. I'm genuinely trying to build something real here, not just rack up views. I read every single comment, so if you've got a theory, a question, or you just want to tell me I got something wrong, drop it down there. I will see it and I will respond. Okay, let's go back to July 27th, 1919. So, to understand why one rock throw could blow up an entire city, you have to understand what Chicago looked like in the summer of 1919. 10 years before this, there were about 44,000 black residents in the whole city. By 1919, over 100,000. This is the Great Migration in full swing. Black families leaving the Jim Crow South by the trainload, chasing factory jobs, chasing the stockyards, chasing a life where they weren't living under lynch law. And Chicago, on paper, looked like the promised land. But here's the overlooked detail, the thing most retellings skip right past. Chicago never passed a single law segregating its beaches, not one. There was no ordinance, no sign, no legal color line anywhere on that lakefront. The segregation at 29th Street Beach was purely social, enforced not by government, but whichever white gang showed up that day to patrol the sand. That distinction matters because it means the violence that followed wasn't the result of a law being broken, it was the result of an unwritten rule being broken, which, if you think about it, is almost more dangerous because there's no clear line, just vibes and fists. So, July 27th, it's a scorcher, 96 degrees. Black Chicagoans are packed onto the unofficial Black Beach at 25th Street. White Chicagoans have 29th Street. And 5 teenage boys, John Harris, Charles and Lawrence Williams, Paul Williams, and Eugene Williams, build a little raft out of a railroad tie and push it out into the water, just to cool off and mess around. Except the current drifts them past the invisible line into the white water. A man named George Stauber, 24 years old, is standing on a nearby breakwater. He sees the raft drift over, and he starts throwing rocks. The boys, at first, they think it's a game. One of them, John Harris, said years later they'd watch the rock come, duck under, pop back up laughing, because come on, a guy throwing rocks 75 feet is not exactly a sniper. Except one connects. Eugene takes a rock straight to the forehead, panics, loses his grip on the railroad tie, and goes under. None of the boys around him can swim well enough to help. By the time a lifeguard gets to him, he's gone. And here's where it gets worse. A police officer named Daniel Callahan is right there on the beach. Black witnesses point directly at Stauber. Callahan does nothing, won't touch him.
Instead, acting on a complaint from a white beachgoer, he arrests a black man on some unrelated minor charge, in front of a crowd that just watched a kid drown. That's the spark. Word spreads down the beach in minutes, and not accurately. Every retelling gets more distorted as it travels. By nightfall, this isn't a story about a drowned teenager anymore. It's an explosion. Now, here's your first mini-mystery, and I want you to sit with this one because we're coming back to it. Within just a few weeks of this riot, a grand jury sits down to hand out indictments. 21 people total get charged. 17 of them are black, 4 are white. Out of a riot where the overwhelming majority of the violence, burning homes, dragging people off streetcars, shooting into crowds, was carried out by white mobs. How does that math work out? Keep that number in your head. We're going to come back to exactly who controlled that outcome, and it's uglier than you think. Okay, so the riot's off and running, and to really get how fast this spread, you need to know Chicago's stockyards were basically a pressure cooker that had been building for months before Eugene Williams ever touched that raft. Black and white workers were competing for the same jobs in the meatpacking plants. Housing in the Black Belt, the narrow strip of the South Side where black residents were basically forced to live, was overcrowded and overpriced, and every time a black family tried to move even one block outside that strip into a white neighborhood, bombs started going off. Actual bombs. Between February and June of 1919, that's 5 months before the riot, there were 8 separate bombings targeting buildings near the edge of the Black Belt. 8. Nobody was ever arrested for any of them. So when the beach incident hits, it's not lighting a fire in an empty field, it's dropping a match into a room that's already full of gas.
For the next several days is chaos. White mobs go into black neighborhoods, dragging people off streetcars and beating them in the street. Black workers heading to and from the stockyards get ambushed on their commute. At one point, a white mob actually surrounds Provident Hospital, one of the only hospitals in the city that treated black patients, and the police, for once, actually hold the line and keep the mob out. That detail rarely makes the cut in the shorter versions of this story, but it matters, because it shows this wasn't simple chaos, it was targeted. And this is where we hit our first real wait, what moment? Because you'd assume the violence was two roughly equal sides going at each other. It wasn't. The Chicago Commission on Race Relations later found that the overwhelming majority of the rioting, arson, and killing was carried out by organized white gangs, and I mean organized, not random mobs. These were groups with names, dues, clubhouses, and this is the part that should genuinely disturb you, political connections straight up into City Hall. The most notorious was a group called Reagan's Coats, founded by a guy named Frank Reagan, who at various points held office as an alderman and police commissioner. Their unofficial motto was, "Hit me and you hit 3,000, because they claimed membership near 3,000 young men. And here's a detail that gets left out of almost every summary of this event. At one point during the riot, members of Reagan's Coats put on blackface, not to hide, to frame. They dressed up in blackface and set fire to Lithuanian and Polish immigrant homes in the back of the Yards neighborhood, specifically trying to trick those Eastern European communities into thinking black rioters had attacked them, so they joined the white mobs. That's not spontaneous rage. That's a calculated psychological operation run in the middle of a riot to recruit more attackers. Local officials, meanwhile, are doing basically nothing. Mayor William Hale Thompson and the police superintendent refuse to call in outside help for days, even as bodies pile up. It takes until the 4th day of rioting before the state finally sends in nearly 6,000 Illinois National Guard troops to actually stop it. And through all of this, through the burnings, through the ambushes, there's a second thing happening that most people never hear about. Black Chicagoans start organizing armed self-defense. Groups of World War I veterans, men who just come home from fighting overseas for a country that wouldn't protect them at home, start arming their own neighborhoods, escorting workers to the stockyards, defending blocks house by house.
The Chicago Defender newspaper had basically stopped trusting the police to protect anybody and started openly telling readers to defend themselves. This wasn't passive suffering, this was resistance, and it's one of the most undertold parts of the entire Red Summer of 1919. Now, remember that number I gave you? 21 indictments, 17 black, 4 white? Here's your second mini-mystery, and this one's the big one. Guess who ends up connected to one of those exact same athletic clubs, the gangs the commission itself blamed for most of the violence? I'll tell you in a minute, but first, the ending of the riot itself, because it does not end clean, and the way it ends tells you everything about who Chicago decided to protect. By August 3rd, 8 days after Eugene Williams drowned, the National Guard has the city locked down enough that the violence finally stops. Final count? 38 dead, 23 black, 15 white, over 500 injured, roughly 2/3 of them black, and somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people, almost all black families, lose their homes to arson. Illinois Governor Frank Lowden creates a commission to investigate, 6 white members, 6 black, which for 1919 was actually a genuinely unusual move. Their final report, called The Negro and Chicago, runs over 600 pages. It names the athletic clubs directly. It names Reagan's Colts. It lays out in writing that these organized white gangs were responsible for the majority of the violence. And almost nobody goes to prison for it. Remember those numbers? 21 indictments, only 5 convictions, and most of those convictions were black defendants too. The white gang members who burned down entire blocks of homes largely walked. Now's your payoff. One of those athletic clubs named directly in the commission's report, the Hamburg Athletic Club out of the Bridgeport neighborhood, had a 17-year-old member in the summer of 1919.
His name was Richard J. Daley. Yes, that Daley. The same Richard J. Daley who, starting in 1955, becomes the most powerful mayor in Chicago's history for over 20 years. The same Daley who later gets elected president of that exact same Hamburg Athletic Club as an adult. For his entire life, Daley was asked over and over whether he took part in the violence during those 8 days. He never confirmed it. He never denied it. He just never answered. Sit with that for a second. The man who would go on to shape Chicago's housing policy, its school system, its police department for over 20 years, decisions that critics say deepened racial segregation in that city for generations, was a teenager in a gang that a state commission directly blamed for the worst race riot in Illinois history. And we will never know for certain what he did on those streets because he made absolutely sure of that. That's not a coincidence you're supposed to notice. That's the kind of detail that gets buried on purpose because it's a lot easier to teach the riot as some tragic, faceless mob event than to connect it directly to a name that shaped the entire second half of 20th century Chicago. One more thing before we wrap, because it's the part that should genuinely bother you the most. President Woodrow Wilson actually came out publicly and blamed white rioters as the instigators in both the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots that same summer. But he never reversed the segregation policies his own administration had put in place inside the federal government. Words, but no action. A pattern you're going to notice shows up again and again if you keep digging into this era. So that's the Chicago race riot of 1919. A kid on a raft, a rock that never should have been thrown, a cop who looked the other way, and a city that had been sitting on a powder keg for years, just waiting for the match. There's a marker now at 29th Street Beach honoring Eugene Williams. For decades, most Chicagoans walked right past it without knowing what it meant. As of the last few years, there's actually a real effort finally underway to install proper memorials across the South Side honoring the 38 people who died, because for 100 years, this story barely got told at all. If you learned something you didn't know walking in, especially that last detail,
do me a favor and drop a comment telling me what stood out to you. I mean it when I say I read every one. And if you want more of these deep, overlooked stories from American history, the ones that actually explain how we got to where we are, hit subscribe because I've got a lot more of these coming. I'll see you in the next one.